before we begin, tell me, what time is it where you are right now, and where in the world are you listening from? If you enjoy drifting off to these long, quiet journeys through history, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next one. Now, settle in, close your eyes if you like, and let's go back in time. Asterisk, the year was 1517, and for most in the heart of the Aztec world, life continued with the rhythm it always had. The sun rose over the valley of Mexico, spilling light across the canals in Chinampa's man-made islands where maize, beans, and squash thrived in orderly rows. Traders walked the causeways into the city, carrying salt, cacao, obsidian, and feathers in colors so vivid they looked as if the gods themselves had plucked them from the sky. But far to the east, along the Gulf Coast, where waves gnawed at the shoreline, fishermen and coastal villagers began to see things they could not name. On certain mornings, faint shapes appeared on the horizon, too tall and too rigid to be clouds, yet too pale to be the dark, jagged ridges of land. These were not the red canoes that glided along their bays. These were towering structures with white cloths that billowed like the wings of giant birds. At first, the sightings were dismissed as tricks of light. After all, the sea could deceive. Mirages danced on the horizon in the midday heat. But the reports grew more insistent. Messengers from Totana communities whispered of strange floating houses that moved without oars, and of men whose skin was pale, who wore metal that glinted like the sun, and whose language sounded like stones striking together in the city of Tenochtitlan. Such news traveled quickly. The Aztec Empire was bound together by an intricate system of runners, known as panani. Could carry messages hundreds of miles in a single day by relaying from one to another. Each runner would arrive, breathless, his message memorized word for word, for errors could mean confusion or disaster. The news of the white-sailed vessels reached the palace of Huey, Tlatoani Great Speaker Moctezuma, to within days. Moctezuma was no ordinary ruler. He was a man deeply concerned with omens and the will of the gods, a scholar of rituals and a strict guardian of imperial order. When the reports arrived, he did not dismiss them as superstition. Instead, he summoned priests, astronomers, and his closest advisors. For generations, the Aztec worldview had been shaped by cycles, worlds born and destroyed by divine forces, and the possibility of another cycle ending was never far from thought. What unsettled Moctezuma was not simply the appearance of strangers. It was the year itself. In the Aztec calendar, this was the year 1 read CE Acatl, a year tied to the return of the god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who, according to some traditions, had once departed eastward over the sea. Stories told that he would return in such a year, bringing change, whether for renewal or destruction. None could say. Moctezuma began sending gifts eastward, hoping to understand these arrivals before they reached the heart of his domain. Runners carried fine cotton garments, gold discs, and featherwork to the coast. The idea was simple. A gesture of goodwill could turn potential enemies into allies. But these strangers did not think as the Mexica did. Gold to the Aztecs was precious for its symbolic beauty, a substance associated with the god's own sweat. To the Spaniards, it was wealth in the most literal sense, currency, power, and ambition made tangible. Meanwhile, life in the empire continued outwardly unchanged. Farmers tended fields, merchants haggled in marketplaces, and craftsmen shaped obsidian blades sharper than steel. But under the surface, unease began to seep into conversations. Traders passing through spoke of foreign animals, great deer without antlers, capable of carrying a man on their back. They described tubes that spat thunder and fire, felling warriors from a distance. And perhaps most strangely, they told of men who seemed both curious and demanding, seeking food, water, and gold in equal measure. The coastline itself became a place of quiet vigilance. Watchers stood on dunes, eyes scanning the horizon for the now familiar sight of white sails. Canoes were kept ready, should messages need to be sent inland at a moment's notice. Villagers debated whether these newcomers were divine messengers, lost travelers, or something far more dangerous. Moctezuma's court began to split into factions. Some urged decisive military action, drive the strangers back into the sea before they gained a foothold. Others counseled patience, arguing that to offend a possible god or divine envoy could bring ruin. Moctezuma, torn between fear, reverence, and caution, hesitated. His decisions in these early days would set the tone for all that followed. The first expeditions of Spaniards, those led by Francisco Hernández de Córdoba in 1517 and Juan de Grijalva, 1518, came and went along the coast, probing, trading, and fighting in equal measure. They were not yet the full force of conquest, but they were the heralds of it. And with each landing, the two worlds inched closer together, like storm fronts moving toward collision, and the calm before that storm. The people of the Valley of Mexico went about their days, not knowing how little time remained before their world would be reshaped. In the great market of Tlatelolco, where thousands gathered daily to buy and sell, there were no signs yet of what was coming. The smell of roasting maize, the sound of haggling, the flash of bright feathers and polished jade. It was a world, still a whole, still confident in its own permanence. And yet, somewhere beyond the curve of the earth, the white sails moved closer. Each tide, each wind, brought them nearer to the capital. The empire's runners could carry news swiftly, but not swiftly enough to outrun the change already set in motion. What did Moctezuma truly believe in those days? Did he see the sails as fate unfolding, or as a challenge he could still master? Or did he, in some quiet chamber, already sense that the end of the Aztec world had begun? The early contacts were not battles in the Valley of Mexico. They were exchanges, awkward, stilted, and filled with misunderstandings. When word reached Moctezuma that these pale-skinned strangers had landed again, this time led by a man named Hernán Cortés, the emperor did not send warriors to meet them. He sent emissaries laden with goods that displayed the empire's wealth and power. Feathered cloaks so soft they seemed woven from air, necklaces of jade and turquoise, shields decorated with gold leaf that caught the light of the sun. The gifts carried messages in themselves. In the Aztec worldview, giving precious objects was both a display of strength and an invitation to mutual respect. But in the Spanish mind, each gold ornament was a promised proof of untold riches waiting to be claimed. Cortés and his men admired the artistry, yes, but they saw something more: the means to fund armies, pay debts, and elevate themselves in Spain's rigid hierarchy from the coastal towns. Moctezuma's envoys brought back unsettling descriptions. The foreigners traveled with strange beast horses, which the Mexica had never seen. At a gallop, these animals blurred into one creature with their rider, like a myth given flesh. They also carried weapons the Aztecs could not match: long steel swords that sliced through obsidian blades, and handheld tubes that exploded with thunder, sending death through the air courts. Unlike earlier visitors, did not linger at the shore. He moved inland, forging alliances with peoples long under Aztec rule. For the Tlaxcalans, the Totonacs, and others who had spent years paying tribute in goods, labor, and lives, the arrival of these foreigners was not an unwelcome omen. It was a possible escape. Courts offered friendship and promises of freedom from Tenochtitlan's demands, and though trust was thin, resentment of the Mexica was deep. Moctezuma's messengers returned not just with tales of foreign weapons and animals, tales of their leader's manner. Cortés was described as calm, calculating, and oddly confident for a man so vastly outnumbered. His interpreter, a Nahua woman called Malintzin by the Mexica and Dona Marina by the Spaniards, could speak both Nahuatl and Maya. Through her, courts could negotiate, threaten, and persuade in ways no other outsider could. She became, in effect, a bridge between worlds, a bridge that could carry peace or war. In Tenochtitlan, debate grew sharper. Some in Moctezuma's court urged him to summon the empire's armies and confront the foreigners before they reached the heart of the valley. The military machine of the Mexica was formidable, trained for years in disciplined warfare. But Moctezuma was reluctant to act with open hostility. The omens still weighed on him. He feared that if courts truly was linked to the god Quetzalcoatl, even if the people believed it destroying him could bring divine wrath. Instead, the emperor tried another approach. More gifts were sent. Gold, fine textiles, anything that might satisfy the strangers and persuade them to turn back. But the more gold courts saw, the more convinced he became that the source lay deeper inland. To Moctezuma's dismay, each act of generosity only pulled the foreigners closer. Meanwhile, the Spanish presence was beginning to alter the fabric of coastal life. Diseases the Mexica had never known, carried invisibly by the newcomers, began to appear in port towns. At first, the fevers and sores seemed like any other sickness, but they spread with unusual speed, and when they struck hard. Many died within days, still in the capital. These illnesses were only whispers, rumors from the edges of empire courts as march toward. Tenochtitlan was slow, but deliberate. At every stop, he gathered more allies, swelling his force with indigenous warriors eager to fight against the Mexica. His column was a moving tapestry. Spanish soldiers in metal armor, native allies in cotton armor and feathered headdresses, horses carrying men high above the crowd, and supply trains of porters carrying everything from food to spare weapons. The runners brought news of each day's advance. The causeways leading into the city, wide enough for 10 men to walk abreast, were inspected and guarded. But the truth was unavoidable. The strangers were coming, and they were not alone. By the time they would reach the valley, they would number in the thousands. Moctezum prepared for their arrival, not with the clamor of war, but with ceremony. He instructed priests to conduct rituals in the great temples, offering incense and blood to the gods in hopes of clarity. He ordered the streets to be cleaned and the canals cleared of debris. If the strangers entered the city, they would see not weakness, but the full splendor of the Mexica capital, a city of whitewashed temples, vibrant marketplaces, and gardens floating on water. Still, unease hung in the air. Fishermen on Lake Texcoco reported dreams of the waters turning black. In the markets, traders noticed fewer buyers as people stayed close to home. And in the emperor's palace, the corridors echoed with quieter footsteps, as if the servants themselves were holding their breath. The white sails had become white banners on land now, carried by men with unshakable purpose. Space for hesitation was closing. Soon, Moctezuma would have to decide not whether to meet the strangers, but how. Would he greet them as guests, or face them as enemies? By the autumn of 1519, the strangers were no longer a distant rumor. They were climbing the high passes into the Valley of Mexico. Their horses' hooves ringing on the stone paths, their banners whipping in the wind. Snow dusted the volcanic peaks of Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, and from those heights, the Spaniards caught their first view of Tenochtitlan, a city shimmering in the middle of a vast lake. Its white temples and causeways like threads linking earth to water. For Moctezuma, the moment was both ceremonial and dangerous. He chose to meet the foreigners on the causeway, surrounded by nobles in feathered cloaks and gold ornaments, each detail of the encounter calculated. The air was heavy with the scent of burning copal resin, rising in pale streams toward the gods. The approach itself was a kind of theater. Cortés came forward, flanked by his captains, armor gleaming under the pale sun. Behind him marched a column of Spaniards, their helmets crowned with plumes, and behind them the ranks of Tenochtitlan allies warriors, who only weeks earlier had been sworn enemies of the Mexica. The sound of the army was a constant murmur of footsteps, the clink of metal, and the occasional startled cry of a horse. When the two leaders finally stood face to face, it was a collision of worlds. Kezuma descended from his litter, his sandals touching the stone, and greeted Cortés in the formal, measured way of Nahua diplomacy. Through Melissen's voice, Cortés responded, presenting gifts of his own glass beads, fine cloth, and other European goods that, to the Spaniards, seemed valuable. But to the Mexica were curiosities. For the people lining the causeways, it was a scene of both awe and unease. The foreigners' pale skin, their beards, their strange animals, and their thundering weapons, all of it defied the rhythms of the known world. And yet, the meeting was outwardly calm. No blades were drawn, no threats made. Moctezuma invited courtiers into the city, an act that would be debated by historians for centuries to come. As the Spaniards entered Tenochtitlan, they walked into a city unlike any in Europe. Wide streets crossed by canals, marketplaces large, enough to hold tens of thousands, gardens filled with flowers brought from distant lands. They were lodged in the palace of Xiacatl, Moctezuma's father, given food and drink, and allowed to move through the city under watch. This was hospitality, but it was also a surveillance. Yet the longer they stayed, the more the balance shifted. Cortés learned the city's layout, its defenses, and its supply lines. His men studied the markets and the temples, noting where gold and silver were kept. And each day, their presence seemed less like that of guests and more like that of watchers, measuring, calculating, waiting for Moctezuma. The days were a tangle of ceremony and unease. He showed Cortés the great temple, the sacred precinct, and the empire's treasures. But with each gift, each revelation, he gave away more than he gained. Cortés' questions were sharp, his gaze lingering not on the gods, but on the metals, the weapons, and the people who could be made into allies or subjects outside the capital. K's news of the Spaniards' presence spread through the empire's tributary states. Some saw it as a chance to break free from Mexico rule. Others feared that the arrival of these strangers signaled the end of the world. In some towns, temples fell silent as priests struggled to interpret the omens, and all the while, delicate fabric of diplomacy frayed. A misunderstanding over tribute here, an insult to a noble Darshmald incident that, in a different time, might have been resolved quietly now, became threads in a larger unraveling. The Spaniards were not leaving. Their numbers, thanks to indigenous allies, were growing, and the diseases they carried, though still only a whisper, had begun to spread. By the time winter approached, the first phase of contact was ending. No longer was this a story of distant sails or cautious exchanges. The strangers were here, in the heart of the empire, walking its streets and dining at its tables. The decisions of the coming months would determine whether they left as honored guests or stayed as conquerors. But in the quiet moments, when the fires burned low and the markets fell silent, the question remained, unspoken yet heavy in the minds of many. Had the fall of the Aztec Empire already begun, not with the clash of armies, but with the simple act of opening its gates? Long before courtiers set foot on the coast, the Aztec chroniclers recorded a series of strange and unsettling events. They were not mere curiosities, but signs almost that, in the worldview of the Mexica, demanded interpretation. In a society where history, religion, and governance were intertwined, such events could not be ignored. It began, they said, with fire in the sky. A blazing light appeared above the horizon and hung there for nights on end, its tail trailing across the darkness, like the plume of a celestial bird. It was not a star, nor a passing cloud, but a comet bright enough to be seen in the daytime. Priests watched from temple rooftops, tracking its path and measuring its glow. In the sacred calendar, such a sign was heavy with meaning. A comet could signal drought, famine, or the fall of rulers. Moctecuma. Then, in the middle years of his reign, took no comfort in the sight. His advisors pored over codices painted manuscripts that preserved the memory of earlier comets. In those records, a comet was almost never a sign of good fortune. Some whispered that the gods themselves were writing in the sky, warning of changes that could not be stopped. Soon after came another sign. Without warning, the great temple of Huitzilopochtli, Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan caught fire. Flames licked up the twin towers, consuming the wooden beams that supported the roof. The cause was never explained. No lightning struck that night, and no enemy had approached the city. The people tried to quench the blaze, throwing water from buckets and clay pots, but the fire seemed to resist. In the end, the structure was blackened and damaged, and the smoke carried the smell of burned cedar far across the lake. For a people whose ruler was both political leader and high priest, such a fire was not just an accident, it was an announcement from the divine. The temple stood at the center of the world, the axis between the heavens and the underworld. If it could burn so suddenly, perhaps the balance of the world itself was shifting. Other omens followed in quick succession. A bolt of lightning struck one of the shrines in Tlatelolco, yet it came from a clear sky without rain. The strike splintered the stone, but there was no thunder before or after, as though the gods had singled out the place for silent destruction. In the lake that surrounded Tenochtitlan, the waters rose suddenly, one season, whipped into waves without any wind. They spilled over the causeways, flooding houses and sweeping away floating gardens. Farmers who depended on their chinampas stood knee-deep in ruined crops. Lake was the lifeblood of the city, a place of fish, waterfowl, and fertile soil, but now it seemed restless, unpredictable. Perhaps the strangest omen was the voice in the night. Ki Paul claimed they heard Ida woman's cry drifting over the dark waters. "Oh, my children, we must flee far away." Some said the voice came from the west, others from the east, but always it was heard near the lake. In later years, this figure would be remembered as La Llorona, the weeping woman, but in Moctezuma's time, she was a mystery. Her warning, if it was a warning, was left unanswered. A few months later, hunters near the imperial storehouses brought in a bird unlike any they had seen before. Its feathers were dark and glossy, but on its head was a strange crest. When presented to Moctezuma, the emperor peered into its eyes and saw a reflection not of himself, but of a vast field of men riding strange animals and carrying weapons that gleamed. Whether the vision was an illusion of the mind or something more, it was recorded in the memory of the court. These signs were not seen in isolation. In the cosmology of the Mexica, events on earth mirrored events in the heavens, and nothing occurred without cause. To the people of Tenochtitlan, the sequence of omens was a message. Something vast and irreversible was on the horizon. But what troubled Moctezuma most was the calendar itself. The year was moving towards CE, a Catalan Rita, year-long associated with the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl, according to certain traditions, had departed eastward and might return in that same year. And if these omens truly marked his return, would it be as a benefactor or as the herald of the empire's end? As the omens multiplied, Moctezuma's court became a place of hushed conferences and restless nights. The emperor had long been a man of careful ceremony, deliberate in both speech and action, but the strange events unsettled even his measured composure. He began spending more time with the keepers of the codices, those painted books in which the memory of the empire was preserved in less time in public gatherings. In the painted histories, the gods were not distant beings, but active forces who could shift the course of human events at any moment. The rise and fall of rulers, the destruction of cities, even the fertility of the land all could be traced to divine will. The omens, therefore, were not random disturbances. They were part of a pattern, a prelude to something immense. The Templo Mayor's fire was repaired quickly, but it left an invisible scar. Pilgrims who came to offer tribute could still smell the faint char in its stones, reminder that even the holiest structures were vulnerable. In marketplaces, in fields, people spoke quietly of the comet and the voice on the lake. Runners passing between tributary towns carried more than goods. It carried these stories, reshaping them with each telling until the whole empire seemed to hum with unease. Moctezuma began making offerings with unusual frequency. In the great plaza, priests burned copal resin until the air was thick and sweet, and they spilled the blood of quail and other animals onto the temple steps. These rituals were meant to restore balance, to reassure the gods that their people had not forgotten their duties. Yet, alongside the religious measures, Moctezuma also turned to the practical. Messengers were dispatched to the coasts, not merely to watch for raiders or rival city-states, but to report any sign of ships, such as those that had visited in years past, carrying pale-skinned men in metal. The emperor did not speak openly of a connection between these possible foreigners and the omens, but in private he must have weighed the possibility. The council of elders, war leaders, and priests was divided. Some argued that the signs demanded a strengthening of the empire's defenses, more warriors on the frontiers, tighter control of tributary cities, and harsher punishment for rebellion. Others saw danger in such displays of force, fearing that they might offend the very powers the omens seemed to represent. Even the common people were drawn into the debate. In the causeways and markets, courtesans and traders discussed whether these events meant the end of the fifth sun, the current age of the world in Aztec cosmology. The sun had been born from sacrifice, and its continued journey across the sky, dependent on human offerings. If the gods were displeased, perhaps they would end the age in fire or darkness. As had happened in the eras before, one day, a delegation of merchants returned from a distant coastal province with a troubling account. They claimed to have seen tall wooden structures moving on the sea ships, though they had been too far offshore to approach. The sails, wide against the horizon, reminded some of the plumes in ceremonial headdresses, but they were vast, towering, higher than the trees. The merchants could not say who was aboard. Their presence, so far from any Mexico port, was enough to stir alarm. The news reached Moctezuma in the midst of a private ritual. He listened silently, then ordered the merchants to rest, feed, and remain in the city. Their descriptions were recorded in detail, their route mapped carefully on painted bark paper, even without confirmation of the stranger's intentions. The emperor sensed that this was no ordinary sighting. The priests, too, felt the weight of the moment. They spoke of the prophecy that Quetzalcoatl, a god of wind and knowledge, might return from the east in a year one reed. They debated whether a return would mean renewal or destruction. Kate, but none could say with certainty. In the evenings, Moctezuma walked the palace gardens, where water channels fed into pools lined with flowers. He would pause by the aviaries, watching the exotic birds brought from distant lands. It is said that in those days he spoke less to his attendants, preferring the company of his thoughts. The empire had never been stronger. Its tribute system was vast. Its armies feared, but strength on paper meant little if the gods themselves had turned the page. And somewhere beyond the horizon, on waters the Mexica had never sailed, events were unfolding that would give the omens a shape. The question now was not whether change was coming, but how soon the sound of it would reach the causeways of Tenochtitlan. LAN. Asterisk. By the start of the year, one read. The omens were no longer events spoken of in past tense. They were currents in daily life. The comet was gone, but the memory of its white trail lingered in the minds of those who had seen it, as if its tail had carved a line straight into the future. The temple's fire had been quenched, but the stones still bore heat-darkened scars, and a voice on the lake, whether truly heard or imagined, was now repeated by children in their games, each retelling, sharpening the warning. My children, we must flee far away. Sema had turned increasingly to divination. Kadini. In the palace's darkened chambers, priests cast grains of maize, watched the movements of water in bowls, and interpreted the patterns of jade beads dropped onto cloth. In the sacred precinct, human sacrifices increased in number, each heart offered in the hope that the gods might be appeased or persuaded to delay whatever change was coming. But fate was no longer a distant shadow. Reports from the eastern provinces grew more urgent. The messengers now described not just ships, but the men aboard them, men with faces pale as lime, wrapped in iron that covered their chests and heads. They carried long sticks that spat fire and smoke, and animals taller than any deer, with eyes that rolled white and nostrils that steamed in the cool morning air. The first real contact was not in the valley of Mexico, but in the coastal lands of the Totonacs. There, the strangers had made camp, building wooden structures and planting a tall cross in the earth. They traded glass beads and iron tools for food, but they also asked questions about the land inland, about the rulers in the great city. On the lake, when word of this reached Moctezuma, he sent gifts once again: fine cotton cloaks, gold ornaments shaped like suns, featherwork so light it seemed spun from air. These were meant both as tokens of hospitality and as subtle signals of the empire's power. But the Spaniards did not treat them as symbols. They valued the gold for its weight and shine, speaking of it with the hunger that disturbed the emissaries. The priests, studying the calendar, reminded Moctezuma that this was indeed CE a Catalan read a year that echoed with the myth of Quetzalcoatl's possible return. The question that split the council was whether these strangers were divine envoys, mortal invaders, or some impossible mixture of both. In the markets of Tlatelolco, the omens had become everyday conversation. Traders debated whether the newcomers would bring goods unknown to the Mexica's strange metals, animals, or foods, or whether they would bring only war. Fishermen on Lake Texcoco reported dreams of the water turning red. Farmers spoke of birds flying west in unusual patterns, and in the temples, priests continued to find signs in the entrails of sacrificed animals that hinted at upheaval. When the Spaniards began marching inland, accompanied by thousands of indigenous allies hostile to the Mexica, the omens suddenly took on a human face. This was no longer the abstract work of the gods hinted at in the sky or in dreams. This was the steady, deliberate movement of men toward the heart of the empire. Moctezuma still held back from open war. His hesitation was not only caution, it was the weight of belief. If these men were connected to a god, killing them might invite a disaster greater than any battle could bring. If they were mortal, perhaps gifts and diplomacy could still turn them away. Asterisk. But with every day's march, the choice narrowed. The signs that had once seemed distant now walked on the causeways in the form of armed strangers. The prophecies, if that is what they were, had stepped out of the shadows and into the bright light of the Valley of Mexico. And in that light, the question that had haunted the empire for years became sharper, harder, impossible to avoid. Were the gods returning, or had they sent something else entirely? Asterisk. Before the clash of empires, before the siege and hunger and ruin, there was the market. In the twin cities of Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco, joined by causeway and water. The marketplace of Tlatelolco was more than a place to buy and sell. It was the pulse of the empire each morning. As the sun rose over the eastern mountains, traders began to arrive from every corner of the Mexica world. They came on foot, in red canoes, or along the stone causeways that stretched like arms across Lake Texcoco. The air was cool in the early hours, but the market square would soon shimmer with heat, voices, and color. The plaza itself was vast, able to hold tens of thousands. Contemporary accounts later, echoed by astonished Spanish visitors, spoke of its size and order. Stalls were arranged in neat rows, each trade clustered together, so a buyer could walk directly to the place where salt was sold, or pottery, or woven mats. There were sections for food, sections for tools, and sections for luxuries that only nobles or wealthy merchants could afford. The food stalls were a world unto themselves. Women sat behind red mats spread with pyramids of tomatoes, avocados, and bright green chiles. There were baskets of beans in shades of red, black, and mottled white, ears of maize both yellow and deep blue, cases filled with cacao beans, the currency of everyday trade. From nearby kitchens, the smell of fresh tortillas drifted over the crowd, mingling with the sharper scent of chili sauces simmering in clay pots. Further along, fishermen from the lake displayed fresh-caught whitefish, axolotls, and small shrimp. Hunters brought in wild turkeys, rabbits, and deer meat wrapped in leaves to keep it cool. Vendors selling cooked meals called out to passers-by, offering tamales filled with beans, squash blossoms, or turkey, and drinks of a totally warm maize porridge flavored with honey or cacao. Beyond food, the market offered the goods of a vast tribute network. From the Gulf Coast came cotton cloth so fine it could be pulled through a ring without snagging. From the hot lowlands came bundles of cacao beans, parrot feathers, and jaguar pelts. From the obsidian-rich highlands came blades sharper than steel, stacked in neat rows and wrapped in woven fibers. Potters from distant towns displayed painted jars, while stone carvers showed small idols, grinding stones, and jewelry. The hum of barter and trade was constant, though cacao beans were common currency. Much exchange was done through direct trade, maize for salt, cloth for pottery, a bundle of firewood for a clay griddle. Experienced market-goers knew how to weigh a handful of cacao beans in their palm, testing for hollow shells or poor quality, and presiding over it all were the Tianquid Pan-Tlac market judges. These officials ensured that goods were sold at fair value, disputes were settled quickly, and thieves were punished. They wore distinctive cloaks so they could be spotted easily in the crowd, and their authority came directly from the ruler. The judges could confiscate goods from dishonest sellers or eject troublemakers from the market entirely. In one corner of the plaza, a section was reserved for potch to long-distance merchants who traveled far beyond the empire's borders. These were not ordinary traders. They were part of a powerful guild, often acting as spies or envoys as much as merchants. Their goods might include greenstone from far to the south, copper bells, or rare shells from the Pacific coast. Speaking in low tones, they exchanged news from distant provinces, sometimes information too sensitive to be voiced in public. The market was also a place of performance. Musicians played drums and flutes, dancers demonstrated ceremonial steps, and storytellers drew small crowds to hear tales of past rulers and legendary battles. It was in these performances that children learned the histories their parents had been taught, and where strangers could hear the official version of the empire story. For the people of Tlatelolco, the market was more than commerce. It was a daily affirmation that the empire was strong, connected, and orderly. The sight of goods from distant lands reminded everyone that the Mexica held sway over mountains, valleys, coasts, and forests. The presence of judges and guards reassured them that order would be maintained, and yet in the final years before the fall. There was a subtle change, barely noticeable to those living through it. Some traders began to speak of new goods appearing in distant markets: small glass beads, unfamiliar cloth, metal knives unlike the obsidian blades of the Mexica. Others whispered of towns where foreign men had been seen, accompanied by large animals that could carry a man on their back. These whispers were easy to dismiss amid the noise of barter and song. After all, the market had seen countless goods and countless faces over the years. But in hindsight, they were the first ripples of a wave that would one day sweep through the plaza, scattering its order and silence alike. The market of Tlatelolco would continue to hum for a while longer, but unseen beyond the lake. The currents of change were already moving toward it. Asterisk on the surface. The market in Tlatelolco still appeared unshaken. The rows of stalls remained neat, the goods abundant, the judges present at their posts. From the rooftop of the nearby temple, the plaza stretched like a woven mat, each color and sound a part of its intricate pattern. The voices of merchants rose and fell like waves, blending with the calls of birds overhead and the steady slap of water against the causeways. But beneath this familiar rhythm, small changes were taking root. The Pachteca, the long-distance merchants, had begun to speak in quieter tones. News traveled quickly among them, yet not all news was for public hearing. Those who had returned from the Gulf Coast brought stories that were repeated only in the shade, away from the ears of market judges. Ships of towering height, strangers who carried weapons of metal, and beasts unknown to the Mexica. Some traders described these foreigners as aggressive and insistent, pressing for food and gold, their speech unintelligible, but their intentions clear. Others claimed the strangers had offered curious objects in exchange: knives that could cut through thick maguey leaves with little effort, beads of colored glass that caught the light like gems, and cloth woven tighter than even the finest cotton. The first of these foreign goods began to appear in small corners of the market. A merchant selling obsidian blades might keep a single iron knife under his stall mat, showing it only to trusted buyers. A beadwork artisan might experiment with the smooth, bright glass beads, threading them alongside turquoise. These items were not yet common enough to change the market's economy, but they stirred curiosity. Moctezuma's appointed inspectors took note. It was their duty to report anything unusual, whether counterfeit cacao beans, unauthorized goods, or rumors of unrest. When questioned, traders often downplayed the significance, claiming the items came from distant allies rather than foreigners. But the inspectors were not blind to the pattern. The goods were unlike anything in the empire's established trade routes. Food, too, began to reflect the distant tension. The fishermen still brought whitefish and axolotls, but some reported that their usual fishing spots near the eastern shore were busier with unfamiliar boats. Hunters brought word that certain coastal villages were seeing more movement along their roads, not caravans of tribute, but groups of warriors traveling toward the shore. The Pachteca Council met in secrecy in one of their guild houses. They debated whether the foreigners represented opportunity or danger. Some argued that alliances with these newcomers could break the heavy tribute burdens the empire placed on subject towns. Others feared that even a small presence of such strangers could disrupt the delicate balance of the empire's tribute system. In the plaza, life continued. The great open spaces still held cellars of salt, maize, and chiles. The rows of potters still displayed jars painted with intricate designs. The smell of roasting turkey meat and simmering beans still drifted over the crowd. On feast days, dancers still performed to the steady beat of the huedo drum, their ankle bells shaking in rhythm. Yet, certain traders noticed shifts in buying habits. Nobles, who once sought feather cloaks or jaguar pelts, now asked more often for gold ornaments, not for ritual offerings, but for hoarding. Cacao prices in some stalls crept upward, an early sign that the economy sensed change before the people admitted it. There were also whispers, too soft for most to hear about. Illnesses along the coast. Merchants who had visited certain towns spoke of fevers that burned quickly, of people covered in sores, and of houses left empty. The stories were hard to confirm, but the Pachteca took them seriously. In the market's carefully ordered world, disease could travel faster than goods. The market, vast and orderly, had always reflected the empire's strength. Every sack of maize, every string of dried chiles, every roll of cotton cloth was proof of a network that reached from mountains to coasts. But now, subtle as the changing of the lake's tide, there was a shift. Goods from beyond the empire's map were seeping in, carried by hands that had seen the pale-faced strangers with their metal and their horses. The judges still kept order, and the buyers still filled the square, but the market stillness was deceptive. The surface was calm, yet under it, currents were moving currents that would one day pull the whole plaza into the undertow of events far larger than the trade of cacao and maize. The question no one could answer, not even the most traveled merchant, was whether the market could remain the empire's heart. When the empire itself was beginning to feel the first strain in its pulse. It was not the sudden arrival of war that first brought the Spanish into the heart of Tlatelolco's market. It was their slow, deliberate entry into the city, days after Moctezuma had invited Cortés and his men into Tenochtitlan. When the strangers appeared in the plaza for the first time, the usual hum of barter and conversation thinned to a hush. Merchants paused in the middle of weighing cacao beans, their hands still over the scales. The buyers stepped aside, giving the wide, open space of the central walkway to the newcomers. The sight was unlike anything the market had ever seen. Spaniards, in metal breastplates that flashed in the sunlight. Helmets crested with feathers or plumes taken as gifts from local allies. Boots of thick leather that thudded heavily on the stone paving. Beside them moved the horse-stall, muscled creatures, whose eyes darted from stall to stall, nostrils flaring at the smell of roasting meat and dried fish. The animals' hooves made a hard, unfamiliar sound against the plaza stones, echoing under the open sky. Behind them, a column of Tlaxcalan allies followed, many carrying goods or serving as translators. To the people of Tlatelolco, it was an unsettling reversals. The very enemies of the Mexica, who had fought them in countless battles, now walking at the side of these pale-skinned strangers. The Spanish did not come to buy maize or salt in the usual fashion. They wandered among the stalls, touching goods, picking up gold ornaments to feel their weight, examining the sharp edges of obsidian blades. Through Melincen's voice, they asked about the origins of each item, where it came from, how far away. Some merchants answered cautiously. Others kept their eyes low and offered little. For a time, the market's order held. The judges, standing at their posts, did not intervene. There was no open violence, no stealing, no breaking of the sacred market laws. But the Spaniard's gaze was different from that of buyers. It was the gaze of men measuring, cataloging, noting what could be taken. A few foreign goods, brought by the Spaniards themselves, began to trade hands that day. Glass beads, bronze bells, and small iron tools passed from Spanish packs into the hands of curious merchants, often in exchange for food, cloth, or precious feathers. These exchanges, seemingly small, planted something new in the plaza. Idea that wealth could come from a source outside the empire's tribute network. The Pachteca, watching from the edges, understood the danger. These strangers became a regular presence in the market. They could undermine the very system that bound the empire together. Tribute was not just taxes, it was proof of power. Goods in Tlatelolco's stalls were more than trade items. They were the physical evidence of conquest and control. But on that day, no decree was made, no confrontation staged. The Spaniards left the plaza without incident, returning to their quarters in the palace provided by Moctezuma. The market's activity resumed, though the hum of voices did not return to its full strength until late afternoon. Still, those who had been there would remember the change. The sight of horses stepping between the maize sellers, the sound of metal clinking against obsidian, the pale hands lifting gold as if weighing the empire's future. The market at Tlatelolco had always been the empire's center of exchange. Now it had also become the place where two worlds had briefly stood face to face, not yet in open conflict, but already testing the boundaries of each other's reach. And in the days to come, when the city's streets ran with water from the lake and later with blood, the memory of that quiet first encounter in the plaza would seem almost impossible, like the still air before a storm that no one realized had already begun. Asterisk. The expedition that would one day reach the heart of the Aztec world began not in the streets of Tenochtitlan, but on the humid, restless shore of the Gulf Coast. Hernán Cortés and his men had landed at a place the Spanish called Villarica de la Vera Cruz, where they built a small settlement of wooden houses and a crude fort. It was here that the decision was made to burn or at least dismantle the ships that had carried them across the ocean, cutting off the possibility of retreat. The act was not as dramatic as legend later claimed, but the effect was real. The Spaniards now had only one path forward. From the settlement, the road inland was both physical and political. A route that would wind through rivers, forests, mountains, and the tangled web of alliances and enmities that defined Central Mexico. Cortés understood from the start that he could not face the Mexican Empire alone. With barely a few hundred Spaniards, even armed with horses, crossbows, and cannons, his direct confrontation would be suicide. His strength would have to come from the peoples who lived under Aztec tribute, those who might see in him a means to loosen the empire's grip. The first such opportunity came with the Totonacs of Simpula. Their city, surrounded by fertile fields and shaded by groves of fruit trees, was impressive but not fortified. The Totonac lords received Cortés cautiously, offering food and lodging, but speaking openly of their resentment toward the Mexica. Each year they were forced to send tribute to Tenochtitlan, cotton, cacao, maize, and even people for sacrifice. The weight of these demands had left them eager for any chance to resist. Cortés positioned himself as that chance. He promised the Totonacs that by allying with him, they could throw off their burdens. To seal the alliance, he staged a public act. When Aztec tax collectors arrived to collect tribute, Cortés had them seized in front of the crowd. Though this was a dangerous gesture, risking direct hostility from Moctezuma, it sent a clear message to the Totonacs that the Spaniards were not in league with their overlords. From Cempoala, the march began in earnest. The column that moved inland was a mix of Spaniards in steel armor, Totonac warriors with cotton shields and obsidian-tipped spears, and porters carrying supplies. Horses moved alongside, their hooves leaving deep marks in the soft earth of the lowlands. The sound of their approach was unlike anything the people of these lands had heard before. The clatter of armor, the creak of leather saddles, the jingling of bridles. It's a steady tramp of many feet. The journey was not without its hazards. The road climbed into cooler, wetter terrain, crossing rivers swollen by rain. Villages along the route sometimes offered food and rest, sometimes shut their gates and sent runners to warn others. News of the strangers spread ahead of them, carried by messengers, traders, and frightened villagers. In each new place, the Spaniards encountered a mix of curiosity, fear, and hostility. One of the most significant encounters lay ahead: the meeting with the Tlaxcalans, fierce warriors whose territory sat between Cortés and the Aztec capital. The Tlaxcalans were bitter enemies of the Mexica, having resisted their expansion for decades. Yet they were also wary of the Spaniards. Its weapons and animals were unknown in these lands. As the column pressed toward Tlaxcala, skirmishes broke out swift. Fierce clashes in which the Spaniards' steel and horses gave them an edge, but in which the Tlaxcalans' numbers and skill were formidable. These battles, though dangerous, became an opportunity. Courts recognized that defeating the Tlaxcalans completely would be a waste. Winning them over could change the balance of power. The march paused in the highlands, the air thinner, the nights cooler. From the ridges, one could look back toward the east and see the hazy line of the coast. Ahead lay the mountains, and beyond them was a great valley where Tenochtitlan waited, still only a name and a rumor to most of the Spaniards. But to the Totonacs and other allies, a place of both awe and resentment. In these early weeks, the march was as much about words as about weapons. Every alliance formed, every tribute town persuaded or coerced, was a step toward building a force that could stand against the Mexica. Courts moved carefully, balancing the Spaniards' need for food and rest with the political need to avoid alienating potential allies. But with each mile covered, the column became more than a band of foreigners. It became a moving coalition of peoples bound together by a common goal, to reach the city and the lake and to decide its fate. What none of them yet knew was how quickly alliances could shift, and how the road they were taking was not just toward Tenochtitlan, but toward the point of no return. Asterisk. The approach to Tlaxcala was tense from the start. The Tlaxcalans, a confederation of fiercely independent city-states, had resisted Mexican dominance for generations. Encircled by Aztec-controlled territories, they had fought off repeated attempts at conquest, enduring both direct attacks and the slow pressure of tribute demands from surrounding provinces. This defiance had made them proud and deeply suspicious of outsiders. When news arrived that a force of armed strangers, accompanied by Totonac allies, was moving toward their territory, the Tlaxcalan Council debated whether to admit them peacefully or test their strength. The decision was swift. These strangers would not pass without proving themselves in battle. The first encounter was sharp and sudden. Tlaxcalan scouts, swift runners armed with obsidian-tipped spears, shadowed the Spanish column, marking their movements. Before long, bands of warriors' faces painted in vivid colors, feathered headdresses swaying with each stride, emerged from the hills. They attacked with cries that echoed across the valleys, the sound carrying a mixture of challenge and warning. The fighting was unlike anything the Spaniards had faced in Europe. The Tlaxcalans fought with speed and coordination, aiming, not always, to kill, but to capture, taking prisoners for ritual sacrifice, the highest honor in their warrior culture. Their cotton armor, layered and quilted, could absorb blows from obsidian blades, and their familiarity with the terrain allowed them to disappear and reappear with unnerving speed. The Spaniards, countered with steel and horses, mounted men, charged into the Tlaxcalan ranks, breaking their formations, while crossbowmen and arquebusiers struck from a distance. The noise of the guns' thunder without clouds startled both warriors and their allies. Yet the Tlaxcalans did not break easily. Day after day, skirmishes flared, sometimes lasting only an hour before both sides withdrew to regroup. In these clashes, Melissen's role was as critical as any soldier's. Captured scouts and messengers were brought to her and through her. Translations. Courts began to understand the Tlaxcalans' motives. They did not fight merely out of hostility. They fought to gauge the stranger's strength, to see whether they were worthy as friends or dangerous as enemies. Gradually, a shift began. The Spaniards' resilience in battle impressed the Tlaxcalan leaders. The sight of horses charging, the crack of gunfire, and the glitter of steel under the sun were unlike anything in the region's long history of warfare. Courts seized the opportunity. He sent envoys to the Tlaxcalan Council, not with threats, but with offers, an alliance against their common enemy, the Mexica. The talks were cautious. Tlaxcalan elders and war captains listened in the council house, seated on reed mats, their faces set in careful neutrality. Courts spoke of freedom from tribute, of shared victories, of spoils taken from the Mexica. He promised to respect Tlaxcalan, independence, a promise that would prove fragile in the years to come. Finally, the decision was made. The Tlaxcalans would join the march to Tenochtitlan. The alliance was sealed not just in words, but in feasts, in ceremonial exchanges of gifts. Warriors who had fought fiercely against the Spaniards only days earlier now stood beside them in the column, their obsidian blades and feathered banners moving in the same direction. The change in the army's appearance was dramatic. Where once there had been a few hundred Spaniards and Totonac warriors, now thousands marched. The sound of the column grew heavier. The dust it raised more visible from miles away, from Tlaxcala. Hey, the route would take them toward Cholula, a city with deep religious significance and a close relationship with the Mexica. The alliance with the Tlaxcalans meant that courts now had both a guide and a warning. The road ahead was not only about gaining allies, but about proving to each city they entered that this coalition was not to be resisted lightly. Still, as the column set out from Tlaxcala, the air was thick with uncertainty. The Mexica were aware of these movements. Their messengers would already be carrying word to Moctezuma that the strangers had not only survived the march inland, but had joined forces with his fiercest enemies. And in the halls of Tenochtitlan, such news could only mean one thing. The meeting between the emperor and the strangers was no longer avoidable, it was inevitable. Asterisk, with the Tlaxcalan alliance secured, the armies marched toward the Mexica capital took on a new weight. The column was no longer a small band of foreigners with a few native allies. It was a moving force that could fill valleys and choke narrow passes, its banners fluttering in the highland wind. The next destination was Cholula, a city whose temples rose in tiers above the plain, crowned by the massive pyramid dedicated to Quetzalcoatl. Gula and Mexica politics. Cholula was not just another city yet, it was a key religious and strategic partner. Moctezuma's emissaries had advised courts to pass through it, perhaps as a way to bring him under closer watch. The reception in Cholula was warm at first. The people offered food and lodging, and the priests led processions through the streets. But the warmth cooled quickly. Courts and his allies noticed that provisions were slow to arrive, and that certain streets seemed to be blocked or under watch. Tlaxcalan warriors, familiar with the city's ties to the Mexica, whispered that something was amiss. The event that followed the massacre at Cholula remains, one of the most controversial in the conquest. Whether the Spanish and Tlaxcalans acted on real evidence of a planned ambush or used it as a pretext, the result was the same. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Cholulans were killed, temples were burned, and the city streets ran red. It was a brutal display of power, sending a clear signal to any city that might consider resisting the march. From Cholula, the route turned toward the mountain passes. The army climbed into thinner air, with the peaks of Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl rose on either side like silent sentinels. The nights were cold, the mornings crisp, and the path wound through pine forests and rocky slopes. Here, the Spaniards caught their first distant glimpse of the Valley of Mexico. Below them lay a vast, shimmering lake, its surface broken by islands and causeways. In the center of it, rising from the water like a vision, was Tenochtitlan, city of white walls, towers, and temples, crisscrossed by canals that glinted in the sunlight. Even the Spaniards, hardened by months of travel and war, paused at the sight. For the Mexica, the valley was the center of the world. The lakes provided fish and waterfowl. The chinampas, floating gardens, produced maize, beans, and flowers in abundance. The causeways connected the city to the mainland, each guarded by gates that could be raised in times of war. From above, the city appeared orderly, radiant, and impregnable as the army descended toward the lake. Messengers from Moctezuma arrived with gifts, fine cloaks, feathered fans, and gold ornaments. The emperor's tone was respectful but cautious. He welcomed the strangers, yet urged them not to come further, citing the city's dangers and its delicate order. Its courts. These words were an invitation in disguise. He pressed forward. Final approach took them along the causeway from Iztapalapa. The lake water lapped against the stones on either side, and the air carried the scent of water plants and distant cooking fires. Canoes moved across the lake, some carrying goods, others slowing to watch the columns progress. The city ahead grew larger with each step, its temples rising above the rooftops, its marketplaces a blur of color and movement even from afar. When they reached the gates, Moctezuma himself was there, borne in a litter, surrounded by nobles in cloaks of dazzling featherwork. The meeting was formal, deliberate, and heavy with unspoken meanings. Words were exchanged through Melanson, gifts were offered, and the two leaders, so different in dress, bearing, and worldview, looked into each other's eyes for the first time. The march was over. The Spaniards and their allies had reached the heart of the empire. The next chapter would not be about the road, but about what happens when two worlds share the same streets, the same meals, and, eventually, the same battleground. And as the causeway gates closed behind them, there was no clear path back. Her name, as the Mexican knew it, was Melinsa. To the Spaniards, she was Dona Marina. In later centuries, she would be remembered with both reverence and resentment. Her name turned into a symbol that could mean either betrayal or survival. But in the months leading to the fall of the Aztec Empire, she was one of the most important voices in the land, literally. Melansan's story began long before she met courts. She was born in a Nahu-speaking community in the eastern lands, perhaps near the borders of modern-day Tabasco and Veracruz. Her family's position was respectable, possibly noble, but political shifts in family arrangements changed her fate. At some point during her youth, she was given or sold into slavery, ending up among Maya-speaking peoples of the Yucatan. It was this movement between worlds that shaped her into what she would become. By the time she entered the Spaniard story, she could speak both Nahuatl and Chantao Maya fluently. This made her invaluable when courts, newly landed and fresh from his first encounters with the Maya of Tabasco, sought to understand the languages of the land he had entered. In those early days, translation was a chain. The Spaniards had Geronimo de Aguilar, a Spaniard who had lived among the Maya and learned their language after a shipwreck left him stranded years earlier. Aguilar could translate between Spanish and Maya. Melanson could translate between Maya and Nahuatl. Together, they formed a bridge. Spanish gives Aguilar, gives Maya, gives Melanson, gives Nahuatl, and back again. This was slow work at first, but it was enough to allow courts to speak with Totonac leaders, Tlaxcalan warriors, and eventually Moctezuma's emissaries. As the months passed, Melanson learned Spanish directly, shortening the chain and increasing her influence. Her role was never limited to words alone. She understood not just the literal meaning of speech, but the layers of diplomacy, insult, and formality that lay beneath. In Nahua society, the way one greeted a ruler, the order in which gifts were presented, even the phrasing of refusals, carried weight. To mistranslate them was to risk turning a neutral meeting into an act of hostility in council meetings. Melanson often sat close to courts, speaking quietly into his ear before addressing the assembled leaders in fluent, formal Nahuatl. Her presence signaled that the Spaniards were listening, and that they had someone who could make their words heard without distortion. This unnerved many Mexica and allied leaders. Words, after all, were as much a weapon as obsidian blades, but Melanson's influence extended beyond translation. She could advise courtiers on how a particular town might respond to an offer of alliance, which rituals should be observed to avoid insult. And when silence was more powerful than speech, she had grown up in the patterns of Nahua and Maya politics, and she recognized the signs of hesitation, resentment, or opportunity in ways no Spaniard could. This knowledge was not abstract. On more than one occasion, it meant the difference between a peaceful negotiation and open battle. She could sense when a gift was genuine or when it masked a trap. She could recognize the subtle shifts in tone that suggested a leader's loyalty was fragile. Her position, however, was not without risk. She was both central to the Spaniards' progress and a constant reminder of their foreignness. Some saw her as a traitor to her people. Others saw her as a survivor who navigated impossible circumstances with skill. In the camps, she moved between the Spanish officers and indigenous allies, equally at ease, giving instructions to Tlaxcalan warriors or explaining the Spanish plan to Totan Aldors. In the march toward Tenochtitlan, her voice became the thread that held the coalition together. Without her, courts would have been limited to the blunt tools of force and gesture. With her, he could weave promises, threats, persuasion into a strategy that reached far beyond the range of his guns. But Melissen's role also meant that she stood at the crossroads of cultures, decisions, and consequences. Every alliance she helped forge, every word she carried across the gap between Spaniard and native, moved the campaign closer to its irreversible climax. And as the causeways of Tenochtitlan drew nearer, she must have known that soon her words would be spoken not in open valleys or neutral towns, but in the very heart of the empire, where a single phrase could change the course of history. By the time the Spanish and their allies reached the shores of Lake Texcoco, Melissen was no longer simply a link in a chain of translators. She was the voice through which two civilizations negotiated their first direct contact. Every meeting with Moctezuma's emissaries, every exchange of gifts, every cautious conversation about the terms of entry into the city passed through her. It was not a neutral position. Words in Nahuatl often carried layered meanings, built through metaphor, poetry, and a deep sense of formality. A ruler might speak in a series of symbolic phrases, comparing himself to a flower, the city to an eagle's nestrata, then making a direct statement. In translating these speeches into Spanish, Melissen had to choose which images to preserve and which to render into plain terms that courts could act upon. She could soften an insult or sharpen a warning. She could frame an offer of peace as a gesture of submission, or an order as a request. Such decisions were rarely simple mistranslations. They were deliberate choices about how best to guide the conversation toward the outcome she believed necessary. When the Spanish first met Moctezuma in person, it was Melissen who carried the words that bridged the gap between them. The emperor spoke in careful, measured tones, welcoming the strangers, but also subtly reminding them of his authority. To Melissen, Cortés responded with equal formality, masking his intentions behind the language of respect and mutual friendship. The two leaders could not fully read each other's expressions, but they could hear each other's voices filtered through her within the city. Her role expanded even further. She became a constant presence in the palace where the Spaniards were lodged, mediating between courts and Mexica officials who oversaw their needs. She instructed Spanish soldiers on the customs they should follow to avoid offense, and she warned indigenous servants about the Spaniards' demands and temperaments. She also became a confidant for some of the Spaniards, who began to rely on her not just for translation, but for counsel. They asked her about the layout of the city, the politics between its neighborhoods, the relationships between Tenochtitlan and his tributary towns. Melissen's answers were precise, but she was careful in what she revealed, and when, among the Mexica, her presence was more complex. Some viewed her as a dangerous instrument of the foreigners. Others saw her as a woman of remarkable intelligence and skill, surviving in circumstances where most would have been powerless. For those who interacted with her daily, she was both an insider and an outsider, someone who understood their world but stood alongside its most unsettling newcomers. Her position allowed her to observe what others missed. She saw the Spanish fascination with gold deepen as they moved through the city's ceremonial centers. She noticed the guarded exchanges between Moctezuma and courts. The pauses in conversation where both men seemed to weigh their next words carefully. She would have heard the whispered doubts among Mexican nobles whether the emperor's hospitality was wise, and how long it could last. In the evenings, when the palace quieted, she sometimes sat with Tlaxcalan allies who had fought alongside the Spanish since the highlands. They, too, relied on her to keep the alliance steady, to ensure that misunderstandings did not turn into broken agreements. It was a role that demanded constant calculation. A misstep in translation could ignite suspicion, insult a ruler, or fracture the fragile network of alliances holding the Spanish advance together. But a well-placed phrase, spoken at the right moment, could open doors that would otherwise remain closed. And as the days passed in Tenochtitlan, Melinson would face her most delicate challenge, yet mediating between guests and hosts when it was clear to everyone that the visit would not end in departure, but in confrontation. In the weeks after the Spanish settled into the palace in Tenochtitlan, Melinson's work became heavier and more dangerous. Every day brought meetings with nobles, priests, and merchants, each with their own concerns and suspicions. The air in the city had changed. The formal welcome of the first days had given way to an undercurrent of unease. Like the faint tremor before a quake, Melinson could feel it in the way people spoke to her. Smiles were tighter, the pauses longer. Couriers brought news of unrest in tributary towns. Rumors swirled through the palace corridors that Moctezuma was a prisoner in his own home, that the strangers meant to take not just gold, but the city itself. For the Spanish, these signs only deepened their resolve to control events. Courts ordered her to arrange more direct conversations with the emperor, pressing him for greater supplies of food, for craftsmen to build weapons, for maps of the surrounding regions. Each request had to be shaped by Melinson into language that would not sound like an outright demand, yet still convey the urgency. She knew the limits of diplomacy. Words could smooth over tension for a time, but they could not change the fact that the Spaniards' presence was growing heavier, their demands sharper, as the Mexican nobles who once listened politely now began to challenge her, asking why she spoke for the strangers, why she aided them in learning the city's secrets. Her position became even more precarious when open violence broke out. In one of the city's temples, a festival turned into a massacre when Spanish soldiers, fearing a conspiracy, attacked unarmed dancers and musicians. The news spread through Tenochtitlan in a single day. The city that had once greeted the Spaniards with gifts now roared with anger. In those days, Melinson's voice was both a shield and weapon. She negotiated safe passage for messengers, calmed Tlaxcalan allies who feared they would be trapped in the city, and spoke directly to Mexican warriors who surrounded the palace, warning that an attack would bring bloodshed to their own streets. But even her skill could not prevent the collapse of trust. The bridges of words she had built over months began to break under the weight of suspicion. Each side listened less and accused more. The Spaniards saw every crowd as a threat. Mexico saw every Spanish move as proof of conquest. When the fighting finally erupted in full the night of sorrows, when the Spaniards fled the city under cover of darkness, Melinson's work shifted from diplomacy to survival. She moved with the column through narrow streets and over causeways under a storm of stones, arrows, and spears. Her words could no longer stop the violence, but they could still direct allies, signal retreat, and keep small groups from breaking apart in the chaos. By the time the survivors reached safety beyond the lake, her role as interpreter had transformed into something larger. She was not only the voice between two worlds, she was a living record of the months when peace had been possible, and of the moments when it had slipped beyond the reach of any tongue. In the campaigns that followed, the alliances remade. The siege of the city, the final Falmelensen, would remain at court side, but the days in which her words could keep swords sheathed were over. From then on, she would translate not to preserve the peace, to shape the terms of victory. And though history will remember her in conflicting lights, traitor, survivor, mediator, no one could deny that, without her, the road from the coast to the capital might never have been walked at all. Asterisk, it was late spring in Tenochtitlan. It's a season when the air was warm but not yet heavy with the rains. The city streets were full of movement canoes gliding over the canals, vendors calling in the marketplaces, priests preparing for one of the most important ceremonies of the year. The festival was to honor Huitzilopochtli, the Mexica's patron, god of war and the sun, and it was to be held in the great sacred precinct at the heart of the city. The plaza within the precinct was vast, enclosed by high walls and dominated by the twin pyramids of the Templo Mayor. Here, under the gaze of stone gods, the ceremony would unfold. Hundreds of warriors, nobles, and dancers had gathered, their bodies painted in bright colors, their feathered headdresses catching the light. The drums hooled, and Tapanasli beat out a slow rhythm that echoed against the temple walls, a heartbeat that seemed to pull the whole city into its cadence. From the Spanish quarters nearby, the sound of the drums carried clearly. Cortés was away at that moment, having left the city to meet a force sent from the coast to challenge his authority. In his absence, Pedro de Alvarado commanded the Spanish garrison. He had been uneasy since Cortés departed. The Mexica, though outwardly calm, seemed restless to him. The constant gatherings in the plaza, the sight of warriors in ceremonial dress, all stirred his suspicion. Alvarado's distrust was not shared by all. For the Mexica, the festival was not a war council, but a sacred duty. The dancers moved in concentric circles, stepping in time with the drums, their ankle bells jingling softly beneath the deeper beats. Priests in black-dyed cloaks moved among them, chanting verses that told of creation, sacrifice, and a debt owed to the gods. From the rooftops of surrounding buildings, onlookers watched the dancers sway, leap, and turn, the sun glinting off. Gold ornaments and obsidian-edged weapons carried not for battle, but for ritual display. The air was thick with the scent of copal resin burning on altars, its smoke drifting upward in white streams. The Spanish, watching from the palace and the edges of the plaza, saw something else. They noted the number of warriors present, the proximity of their weapons, the way the dancers could quickly close ranks if needed. In their minds, the festival looked less like devotion and more like a gathering of fighters ready to strike. Melinsa moved between Spanish officers in Mexico, attendants carrying questions and reassurances. The Mexica priests explained that the weapons were ceremonial, the gathering purely religious. But Alvarado's mind was fixed on the possibility of an ambush. He had heard rumors, perhaps from Tlaxcalan, Alex, that the festival would be the moment when the Mexica turned against the Spanish. The rhythm of the drums went on, steady and unbroken. Each beat seemed to carry both the weight of tradition and the shadow of suspicion. The plaza was filled with life, yet somewhere in its movement there was a tension. Invisible, but felt by nightfall, the festival would still be in full swing. The dancers still circling the temple, the chants still echoing in the precinct. But the day's harmony was already fragile, balanced between the Spaniards' mistrust and the Mexica's sacred purpose. The question was not whether something would break it, but when. Asterisk, the next morning, the festival resumed with even greater energy. Sunlight poured into the sacred precinct, lighting the feathers of dancers as they whirled in tight, deliberate patterns. The great drums pounded in unison, their sound rolling over the plaza like distant thunder. The chants rose and fell, calling on the gods to renew the world, to keep the sun's journey steady across the sky. From the Spanish quarters, Pedro de Alvarado stood watching. The more he observed, the less he saw a dance, and the more he imagined a trap. The men in the plaza were warriors as well as celebrants. The obsidian-edged weapons, though ceremonial, could be made deadly with a single order. The walls of the precinct enclosed a space entirely an arena where the Spaniards could be surrounded in moments if an attack were planned. Some of his captains urged patience. Others, including certain Tlaxcalan allies, whispered that this was the moment that Mexico would strike. The rumors took root in Alvarado's mind, whether they were born of genuine intelligence or simple fear. They confirmed what he was already inclined to believe, that the only way to prevent an uprising was to strike first. The decision, when it came, was quick. Spanish soldiers, armed with swords, lances, and crossbows, moved into position at the entrances to the sacred precinct. The dancers, intent on the rhythm of the drums, seemed not to notice at first. The priests continued their chants, their faces turned toward the temple steps. Then, at a signal from Alvarado, the Spaniards surged forward. Steel clashed against wood and bone. The suddenness of the attack shattered the festival's rhythm. The drums stopped mid-beat. The dancers froze. For a moment there was only the sound of shouting. The Mexica tried to defend themselves, but their ceremonial weapons were no match for steel swords. The plaza, moments earlier filled with music, became a place of chaos. The scent of copal smoke was overwhelmed by the smell of blood. Those who tried to flee found the exits blocked. Those who stood their ground were cut down in the streets. Beyond the precinct walls, the sounds carried outward. Onlookers and market-goers stopped what they were doing, listening as the noise shifted from music to screams. Runners raced through the city, carrying word that the Spaniards had attacked the festival, killing unarmed warriors and priests. Inside the palace, the Spanish garrison prepared for retaliation. They knew the killings would not be seen as a preemptive defense, but as an act of treachery. The Tlaxcalan allies tightened their ranks, knowing they would be marked alongside the Spaniards. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, the plaza lay still. The bodies of dancers and priests were scattered where they had fallen, their bright costumes darkened. The drums, silent now, stood abandoned by the temple steps. That night, the city's mood changed. The people of Tenochtitlan, who had endured the stranger's presence with wary patience, now had cause for rage. The trust, fragile and strained though it had been, was gone, and with its breaking, the streets of the city would soon become a battleground. The morning after the attack, the streets of Tenochtitlan were no longer the broad, open causeways the Spaniards had marched through weeks earlier. They had become channels of watchful eyes. Canoes passed slowly along the canals, their rowers pausing to look toward the palace where the Spanish garrison remained. Women at the market stalls no longer called out their goods. They whispered among themselves, glancing toward the foreigners with cold, measuring expressions. News of the massacre at the sacred precinct had traveled faster than any runner could carry it. Every household seemed to know the details, how the drums had been silenced, how the dancers had fallen, how priests had died with their hands still raised in ritual gesture. Whether each detail was true or shaped by retelling mattered little. The meaning was the same. The Spaniards had desecrated the heart of the city. Moctezuma's position, already precarious, became almost impossible. The people no longer saw him as the dignified host who had welcomed the strangers into the city. Now, some accused him of weakness, others of complicity. In the palace, he remained guarded, speaking cautiously with Alvarado through Melanson, urging restraint, but his voice no longer carried the same weight outside its walls. Asterisk. The city began to change its posture. Bridges on the causeways were raised more often. Canoes ferried supplies to storehouses instead of markets. Young men drilled quietly in courtyards, spears and shields stacked nearby, Spanish patrols through. The streets found themselves shadowed, not by curious children, but by armed warriors. Alvarado, realizing the danger, tightened security around the palace. Gates were reinforced, guards posted at every corner. Tlaxcalan allies kept watch alongside the Spanish soldiers, their own faces set in grim readiness. In the evenings, the sounds of the city shifted. The songs and music that once drifted through the streets gave way to the creak of oarlocks and the low murmur of watchmen. Fires burned in more places than usual, their glow reflected in the canals like scattered stars. Melanson moved constantly between the Spanish commanders and Mexican messengers. But even she could feel the narrowing space for negotiation. Every message carried to the palace was sharper than the last. Demands for the Spaniards to leave. Warnings that their welcome was over. Then came the first open act of defiance. A group of warriors blocked a supply delivery bound for the palace, forcing the Spanish to send an armed escort to retrieve it. The exchange was tense, but Bloodless said it marked a turning point. The city was no longer simply watching. It was beginning to squeeze Dot from the palace rooftop. The view across Lake Texcoco was deceptively calm. The water shimmered under the sun. Fishermen paddled in the shallows, and distant mountains framed the horizon. But within the streets and canals, the current was turning. The Spaniards did not yet know the exact night it would happen, but the path was already set. The city would rise. The palace would become a trap, and the causeways would become a gauntlet. The feast of Huitzilopochtli, meant to renew the world, had instead broken the fragile balance between two powers. Now, that balance would give way to the chaos of the Night of Sorrows. Asterisk. In the worldview of the Mexica, gold was precious, but not in the way the Spaniards understood it. To the Mexica, Teocuitlali, the excrement of the gods, was valued for its beauty, its ability to reflect the sun, and its role in offerings to the divine. Gold adorned temples and warriors. It gleamed on ritual masks, and it was worked into delicate jewelry. But it was not currency. It was not hoarded as a store of wealth, nor used to buy bread or maize. So when Moctezuma presented courts with the gifts of gold upon his arrival in Tenochtitlan, he was not impoverishing his city or surrendering its treasures. The key was following the rules of diplomacy. Fine feather cloaks, jade ornaments, cacao, and gold were the appropriate tokens of respect for honored guests. The act was ceremonial and affirmation of the empire's abundance, a reminder that the Mexica could provide beauty beyond measure. The Spanish saw something else. When courtsmen held the gold objects in their hands, necklaces shaped like serpents, tisks hammered thin and shining like captured sunlight, they did not see offerings or symbols. They saw wealth. In their minds, each piece could be melted, weighed, and sent back across the ocean to buy estates, titles, and influence. The misunderstanding was immediate and deep. To Moctezuma, the gold was a gesture meant to impress and appease. To the Spaniards, it was a sign that more lay hidden within the city's storerooms and temples. Where the emperor saw the close of a ritual exchange, the foreigners saw the opening of a mind. This difference in perception began to shape their interactions. The Spaniards asked where the gold came from, how much was kept, and in what form. They pressed for tours of storerooms, for introductions to the goldsmiths who shaped the metal into art. The Mexica obliged at first, seeing no danger in showing their craftsmanship. Akoya But each display only fed the Spaniards' conviction that more could be obtained in the palace where the Spanish were lodged. Koyak ornaments began to accumulate gifts from Moctezuma, items traded or taken from other quarters of the city. Spanish soldiers polished them, weighed them, and spoke openly about the fortune they would carry home. Tlaxcalan and Totonac allies, hearing these conversations, began to measure the Spaniards' intentions with new caution. The Mexica goldsmiths, themselves worked with quiet skill in workshops lit by the glow of hearths. They shaped the soft metal into discs, chains, and intricate forms of animals and gods. Each piece was made for a specific purpose: an offering in a temple, an adornment for a noble, a symbol in a ceremony. None were made for the simple satisfaction of owning gold for gold's sake. In the marketplace, gold was far from the most common medium of exchange. Cacao beans, cotton cloth, and finely crafted goods held more practical value in trade. But now, Spanish soldiers moved through the stalls with eyes only for the glint of metal, ignoring the abundance of maize, salt, fish, and pottery. The more the Spaniards admired the gold, the more uneasy some Mexican nobles became. They understood that a man could desire beauty, but the foreigner's desire seemed different. It had no limit. It was not about wearing the gold, offering it to the gods, or marking a great occasion. It was about having it, all of it, in whatever form could be carried away. By the end of their first weeks in Tenochtitlan, the palace storerooms where the Spaniards stayed held more gold than any single noble's residence. And still, it was not enough. The misunderstanding had become a seed, one that would soon grow into suspicion on both sides. For the Spaniards, the question was how much gold the city truly held. For the Mexica, the question was what kind of guests they had invited into their heart. The more time the Spaniards spent in Tenochtitlan, the less they treated gold as a symbol of hospitality, and the more they pursued it as a goal in itself. What had begun as admiration for gifted ornaments soon became an active search, one that reached into the city's temples, workshops, and began subtly. Spanish officers, under the guise of curiosity, asked to see more of the empire's treasures. Moctezuma, still committed to preserving peace, obliged. He allowed them to visit the Teocalli storerooms, where gold objects waited for upcoming ceremonies. Here were masks inlaid with turquoise, pendants shaped like hummingbirds, and fine chains as light as cobwebs. The Spaniards marveled openly, their hands lingering on each piece longer than courtesy allowed. But what for the Mexica was a display of honor became, in Spanish minds, a survey of assets. They began to ask how often new gold was worked, how much tribute arrived from other cities, and whether it was stored in the capital. The questions were framed politely, but the intent was clear. They were not simply admiring artistry, they were measuring a fortune. The workshops of the goldsmiths became a particular focus. These artisans, masters of their craft, worked with tools of wood, bone, and stone, shaping molten gold into forms as precise as any work in Europe. Their skill lay in lost wax, casting, hammering, and delicate filigree. The Spaniards watched closely, not to learn the craft, but to estimate the supply of raw gold that passed through their hands. In time, Spanish soldiers began to move through the city in pairs or small groups, visiting markets and noble houses with an eye not for food or goods, but for signs of hidden wealth. Their Tlaxcalan and Totonac allies sometimes guided them, pointing out which districts were wealthiest, which households had gold as part of their ceremonial regalia. These allies, still enemies of the Mexica, saw advantage in feeding Spanish suspicion. Moctezuma noticed the shift. The tone of Spanish requests was changing from curiosity to insistence. Gifts were no longer enough. Each offering seemed to provoke a question about what more could be given. The emperor responded by increasing the ceremonial exchanges, sending gold along with fine textiles and other tribute items. But instead of satisfying the Spaniards, it only convinced them that greater hoards were being withheld. The palace where the Spanish stayed began to resemble a treasury. Gold discs leaned against the walls, ornaments were piled in chests, and smaller pieces were tucked away in saddlebags and personal packs. Yet, even surrounded by such wealth, the soldiers spoke of finding the real treasure, the imagined vast reserves hidden deep within the city. This single-minded pursuit began to erode the careful balance that had allowed the Spanish to remain in Tenochtitlan without open conflict. To the Mexican nobles, the Spaniards' fixation was a warning. These were not guests who could be honored and then sent on their way. These were men who would strip the city of its sacred ornaments, melt them down, and carry them across the sea, never to be returned to the gods or the people. In the great market of Tlatelolco, sellers began to withdraw gold items from display. In the temples, priests moved certain offerings deeper into the sanctuaries, away from foreign eyes. But even these precautions fed Spanish suspicion. Why hide such things unless they were part of an even larger cache? The misunderstanding over gold had become more than a cultural difference. It was turning into a point of collision. For the Spaniards, the city was a vault waiting to be opened. For the Mexica, the gold was part of the city's soul, something that could be given in measured gestures, but never surrendered in full. And as the Spaniards' demands grew sharper, the Mexica's patience thinned. By late in the Spaniards' stay, the question of gold had ceased to be a hidden undercurrent. It was now an open tension running between the palace walls and the streets outside courts. Himself had ordered that the gold in the Spaniards' possession be gathered into a single hoard. In the courtyard of their quarters, soldiers piled the gifts Moctezuma had given ornaments, discs and chains, alongside treasures taken in quieter, less ceremonial exchanges. The heap grew until it shone like a second sun, its gleam visible even from shaded corners. Tlaxcalan and Totonac allies watched with mixed feelings, admiring the wealth, but aware of what it represented. To the Mexica, this was no longer the behavior of guests. It was the behavior of occupiers. Gold taken from the temples was no longer fulfilling its sacred role. Ornaments meant for the gods were now being melted into bars in crude molds, shapes destroyed to make them easier to transport. The transformation was both physical and symbolic, a breaking of the link between the gold and its divine associations. Word spread quickly through the city. In the market at Tlatelolco, merchants muttered about the foreigners who weighed the gods. Gifts like sacks of maize. In the neighborhoods along the canals, women told how they had seen Spanish soldiers carry ornaments wrapped in cloth, slipping them into their packs. The resentment was no longer quiet. It was spoken openly in homes, on walkways, in the boats that crossed the lake. Moctezuma, still trying to hold the city together, addressed Court Rs through Melinson with increasing urgency. He urged moderation, reminding the Spaniards that their presence depended on the goodwill of the people. But courts, convinced that more treasure was hidden, pressed for details: where it was stored, who held the keys to it, and how it might be brought out. In the minds of the Spanish soldiers, the gold had already begun its journey home. They imagined the chests loaded onto ships, the weight of them in the hold, the gleam of it under the Spanish sun. For them, the risk of alienating the Mexica was balanced against the reward of returning with fortunes that would transform their lives. For the Mexica, the risk was existential. If the Spaniards could strip gold from temples without consequence, what would they take next? The maize from the granaries, the tribute from the provinces, the very sovereignty of the city. The tension crystallized one evening when a small group of Spanish soldiers, accompanied by Tlaxcalan allies, entered a temple district without permission. They claimed to be searching for hidden idols, but emerged carrying wrapped bundles that clinked with metal. A crowd gathered, shouting for the return of the ornaments. The Spaniards, unwilling to hand them back, retreated quickly to the palace under a hail of insults and thrown stones. It was a small incident, but it carried the weight of a breaking point. The city's patience was fraying, and the Spaniards' presence was shifting from an uneasy truce to an intolerable occupation. In the weeks to come, gold would become more than a point of greed, would be a burden. When the Spaniards eventually fled the city under cover of darkness, they would try to carry it with them, their chests heavy as they ran along the causeways. Some would drown under its weight in the waters of Lake Texcoco, pulled down by the very treasure they could not bear to leave behind. In the end, the gold meant everything to the Spaniards and nothing to the Mexica except as a symbol of how far their world had shifted and how much more they stood to lose. It did not happen in a single violent instant. There was no storming of the throne room, no public declaration that the emperor was now a prisoner. Instead, it began quietly, like a door closing in a way that seemed ordinary, till you realized it had been locked behind you. Courts had been watching the tension in the city grow since the massacre at the sacred precinct. He knew that Moctezuma's position among his own nobles was weakening, and that the emperor's authority was slipping in the eyes of the people. Yet, Moctezuma remained in daily contact with the Spaniards, continuing the careful exchange of gifts, meals, and formal speeches. A pretext came in the form of an accusation. News reached the palace that a group of Mexica officials on the coast had attacked a Spanish garrison, killing several men. Courts seized on this as evidence that Moctezuma could not be trusted to control his own governors. In Spanish eyes, the emperor had to be protected, a word that concealed the reality: detention. The plan was carried out under the guise of a formal visit. Courts, accompanied by armed men, entered Moctezuma's chambers with Melintzin at his side. The conversation began politely, with the usual ceremonial greetings. Then, through Melintzin, Courts accused the emperor's officials of treachery. He said that until the matter was resolved, Moctezuma should reside within the Spanish quarters not as a prisoner, but as an honored guest under their guard. It was a careful manipulation. Refusing the suggestion outright would risk confrontation then and there. Accepting it could be framed as an act of cooperation. Cap still, believing he could manage the Spaniards from within their walls, agreed. Once inside the Spanish quarters, the nature of the arrangement became clear. Guards were posted at all entrances. Moctezuma's movements were restricted to certain rooms and courtyards. Visitors were screened, their numbers limited, their conversations watched. Outwardly, the Spaniards maintained the appearance of respect. Moctezuma was treated with ceremony, his meals prepared with the same care as before, his attendants allowed to remain. He still wore his fine cotton robes, still received messengers, still spoke in the formal tones of a ruler. But the difference was visible in the palace gates, now closed and watched by armed men who answered not to him, but to court us for the people of Tenochtitlan. The change was shocking. Their emperor had not been overthrown in battle, nor captured in a siege. He had walked willingly into the foreigners' keeping, and now he was seen only in the guarded courtyards of their quarters. The sight was unsettling, a living symbol of power made powerless. Some Mexican nobles argued that Moctezuma was still in control, that he was simply acting strategically to keep the city safe until the Spaniards left. Others saw it as the moment. The empire's heart had been bound, its pulse slowed by foreign hands. Inside the palace, Moctezuma continued to speak with courts daily. He received orders from his officials and passed them on, but each instruction now had to pass through the Spaniards' watchful presence. He was still the Huey Tlatoani in name, but the space between his words and their execution was narrowing in that space. The Spaniards stood. The gates had closed quietly, but they would not open again without a fight. From the moment Moctezuma began living inside the Spanish quarters, Courts moved quickly to use the emperor's authority as a shield for his own commands. Orders for tribute, supplies, and labor were still issued in Moctezuma's name, but they were drafted with Spanish needs in mind. If courts wanted more food for his soldiers, the request was written as an imperial order. If he required craftsmen to repair weapons or build fortifications, it came from the emperor's mouth. Even calls for gold, now in open demand, were couched in the language of royal decree. The messengers who carried these orders to the provinces still bowed before Moctezuma before departing. But when they returned, their goods were delivered to the Spaniards, Storerooms, to the Mexica officials who visited. The arrangement was deeply unsettling. They entered the Spanish-guarded courtyard and saw their ruler seated on a mat, tended by his household, but surrounded by foreigners whose steel weapons glinted in the sunlight. Moctezuma still spoke with dignity, still used the elaborate phrases of Nahu court language, but his words passed through Melissen's voice to courts, who often added his own instructions. Some visitors began to notice subtle changes in the emperor's tone. Where once he had issued commands with the certainty of divine authority, he now sometimes spoke as if negotiating, explaining why an order was necessary rather than simply declaring it. It was a shift so small that outsiders might miss it, but to those who had served him for years, it was a sign that the weight of captivity was pressing in. The Spaniards, for their part, maintained a careful balance. They knew that Moctezuma's visible cooperation was vital. So long as the emperor appeared to endorse their presence, many towns and provinces would comply rather than rebel. Openly humiliating him would undermine their own position. Instead, they treated him with outward respect while quietly removing the freedoms that gave his position real power. Moctezuma's days became a cycle of ceremonies stripped of their independence. He received visitors in the morning, discussed governance with his council under Spanish oversight, dined in the afternoon on maize, turkey, and cacao, spent the evenings in conversation with courts. He was still served in fine dishes, still clothed in the richest cotton, but the city beyond the palace gates was no longer under his unchallenged control. Among the people, resentment grew. Whispers spread that the emperor had submitted to the foreigners, that he no longer acted for the gods, but for the men in iron. Others, more sympathetic, argued that he was sacrificing his pride to protect the city from destruction. In the markets, in temples, the debate was constant, but always quiet-spoken in corners, never shouted in the open. The Tlaxcalan and Totonac allies saw the situation differently. To them, Moctezuma's captivity was proof of Spanish strength. They had fought against the Mexica for years, and now they watched their old enemy's ruler act at the command of Tamscant, their new allies. For them, this was not a tragedy, but a turning of the tide. Even so, there was a sense among friend and foe alike that such an arrangement could not last indefinitely. An emperor could not remain both ruler and prisoner without the mask eventually slipping. The longer Moctezuma stayed in the Spaniards' quarters, the more the city would question whether his words were truly his own. And when that doubt grew too deep, no guard, no ceremony, and no translation could hold back the consequences. As the weeks passed, Moctezuma's captivity became an open secret. The Spaniards still referred to him as the ruler of the Mexica, still addressed him with honorifics, still accepted the ceremonial offerings brought to him by visiting nobles. But everyone in Tenochtitlan could see the truth. The gates of the Spanish quarters were guarded day and night, and Moctezuma no longer walked freely through his city. The emperor's presence in the Spanish camp was not only symbolic, it was strategic. Courts used him to summon messengers from distant provinces, to demand supplies, and to compel obedience in towns that might otherwise rebel. When orders were delivered in Moctezuma's voice, they carried the weight of tradition and divine mandate. But those who obeyed began to wonder whether they were following their emperor's will or the will of the men who held him. Small acts of resistance began to appear. Shipments of food arrived late or in smaller quantities. A tribute was paid in goods of lesser quality. In some towns, imperial messengers returned empty-handed, claiming that the roads were blocked or that the harvest had failed within the city. The nobles, who still visited the emperor, did so under the watch of Spanish guards. They spoke in formal tones, but behind their polite phrases were questions they could not voice openly. Was Moctezuma acting to save his people, or had he surrendered to the strangers entirely? Moctezuma himself seemed to change. The man who had once moved with absolute authority now spent long hours seated in silence, listening more than speaking. He continued to perform the gestures of rule-receiving guests, giving thanks for gifts, blessing ceremonial offerings, but his voice carried less force. Even his own attendants, loyal to the end, could see the wear in his expression. The Spanish, meanwhile, tightened their grip. They stationed more men at key points around the palace, restricted the flow of visitors, and monitored every exchange between Moctezuma and his envoys. Courts understood that as long as the emperor appeared compliant, the city's unrest would remain contained. But he also knew the balance was fragile. One open act of defiance from Moctezuma could shatter it. That fragility was tested when news of the massacre at the sacred precinct spread through the city. Crowds began to gather near the palace walls, shouting for the Spaniards to leave. At first, Moctezuma attempted to calm them, speaking from a balcony in the formal, measured style of a ruler addressing his people. Some listened, but many turned away, their trust already broken. In those moments, the mask of his authority slipped. The people saw not the Huey Tlatoani commanding from his own palace, but a ruler surrounded by foreign guards, speaking in words shaped by others. The magic of the old order was fading. The Spaniards could keep Moctezuma inside the palace, but they could not keep the city's doubts outside its walls, And as the murmurs of discontent grew into open defiance, the role of the captive emperor would soon cease to be an ascetant, become a danger to everyone holding him. The air over Tenochtitlan had changed. The canals still carried canoes, and the marketplaces still bustled. An undercurrent of hostility now ran through every street. The massacre at the sacred precinct had stripped away the last veil of diplomacy. The Spaniards, once curious guests, were now seen as invaders, their every movement watched by eyes that no longer looked on them with restraint. The palace, where the Spanish and their allies were quartered, had become a fortress. Gates were kept closed, guards stood at every entrance, and sentries watched the rooftops for signs of archers. The Spaniards' Tlaxcalan allies crowded into the courtyards, uneasy in the very city they had marched to conquer. Moctezuma, still within the Spanish quarters, could feel the weight of the change as well. When he tried to address his people from a balcony, his words were met with shouts, curses, and stones. The spell of his authority, held together for months despite captivity, was gone. His voice could no longer hold the city back. The Mexica. Warriors began to move with deliberate preparation. Causeways were partially dismantled to control movement. Canoes patrolled the waterways at night. The bridges that spanned gaps in the causeways could be removed at a moment's notice. From the rooftops, lookouts watched the palace, passing messages with whistles and hand signals. Inside the Spanish quarters, courts weighed his options. The city was closing in, supplies were running low, and reinforcements from the coast were uncertain. Every day spent within the walls increased the risk of being trapped completely. The only escape route lay across the causeways, narrow stone paths surrounded by water and guarded at both ends. The decision was made in quiet councils. They would leave under cover of night. Courts ordered his men to prepare in silence, gathering weapons, armor, and as much gold as they could carry. The treasure, taken over months from gifts, storerooms, and temples, was melted into bars for easier transport. Soldiers stuffed them into packs, their weight heavy even before the march began. The plan was to slip away during the darkest hours, when the city's vigilance might be thinnest. Horses would be shod for silence, and the column would move in strict order, cavalry at the front and rear, infantry in the middle, allies carrying supplies and wounded. But leaving unnoticed from the heart of Tenochtitlan was a hope more than a certainty. The city was a web of canals and narrow streets, its people alert and ready for the slightest disturbance. Even at night, the waters carried sound. The creak of oars or the ring of metal could travel far. On the eve of the escape, the atmosphere in the palace was thick with tension. Spanish soldiers tightened straps on their armor, checked the edges of their swords, and divided the treasure into loads. Tlaxcalan allies gathered their belongings, some taking only weapons, others carrying burdens of gold, despite warnings that speed would be their greatest defense. Above it all, the city seemed to listen. Fires burned on distant rooftops, their light reflected in the still waters of the lake. Somewhere beyond the walls, the low beat of a drum began, slow, steady, and unbroken. It was not a call to dance. It was a call to wait. The night chosen for the escape was moonless. Clouds hung low over the lake, muffling what little starlight reached the city. Then the Spanish quarters. The preparations were silent, but urgent. Horses saddled, packs lifted, weapons checked one last time. The air was heavy with the smell of oil, leather, and damp stone. At a whispered command from Cortés, the gates opened just enough for the first riders to pass. The column began to move, cavalry in the lead, followed by infantry, the treasure-laden carts, and finally more horsemen at the rear. The Tlaxcalan allies filled the spaces between, carrying supplies and weapons, their faces tense. The first streets were eerily quiet. The sound of boots and hooves on stone echoed in the narrow corridors, broken only by the faint splash of water in nearby canals. Shadows shifted on balconies, but no challenge came. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that they might reach the causeway unnoticed. When they reached the edge of the city, the causeway stretched ahead, a narrow road of stone across dark water, broken at intervals by gaps where removable bridges had been lifted away. A portable wooden bridge, built in secret, had been brought along to cross the first gap. Soldiers lifted it into place, the wood creaking under the weight of men and horses. The column began to cross. Hooves rang softly on the planks, then onto the stone beyond. The first gap was behind them. The plan was to retrieve the bridge and carry it forward to each new gap, laying it down, crossing, and lifting it again. But the weight of the gold slowed the movement. Men carrying bars in their packs struggled to keep pace, and carts groaned under their loads. Halfway to the second gap, the sound came first, a shout in the darkness, then the sharp blast of a conch shell across the water. Lights flared. Drums began to beat, fast and insistent, the rhythm echoing across the lake. Canoes appeared on either side of the causeway, their paddles slicing the water in perfect unison. The Mexica had been watching from the darkness. Arrows and spears flew toward the column. Stones, hurled from slings, struck armor and shields. The shouts grew louder as more warriors poured toward the causeway from the city's far end. The Spaniards tried to press forward, but the next gap yawned before the portable bridge was still behind, trapped under the press of men. Panic rippled through the column. Horses reared, carts tipped into the water, and men, burdened with gold, struggled to keep their footing. Some tried to swim across the gap, their armor dragging them down. The lake water swallowed not just treasure, but men, horses, and weapons. In the chaos, the darkness became alive with movement, canoes ramming the causeway's sides. Warriors leaping onto the stone, fighting in close quarters. Steady order of the escape plan was gone, replaced by desperate shouts and the clash of steel against obsidian. Above it all, the drums pounded on, faster now, as if marking the heartbeat of the city itself. The night was no longer an escape. It was a trap sprung in the center of the lake. Asterisk, the second gap became the night's turning point. With no bridge in place, the column stalled under a rain of missiles from the canoes swarming on either side. The Spaniards tried to push forward, but the press of men, horses, and treasure carts trapped them in a tangle of panic. Some soldiers hurled planks and timbers into the gap, trying to make a crude crossing. Others leaped into the water, clutching their weapons or packs, hoping to swim. Many sank within moments, pulled under by the weight of armor or the bars of gold they refused to abandon. The lake's black surface hid them within seconds, the ripples closing as if swallowing the evidence of their struggle. Those who reached the far side of the gap found no safety, only another stretch of stone already filling with Mexican warriors. The fighting was hand to hand now, obsidian blades flashing in the dark, shields splintering under the force of steel. Tlaxcalan allies fought desperately alongside the Spaniards, forming tight clusters that tried to push forward, step by step, toward the shore. Behind them, causeway became a battlefield and a grave. Horses screamed as they toppled into the water, their riders flung clear or dragged down with them. Canoes slammed against the stone edges, warriors climbing up to strike before slipping back into the water's shadows. The treasure, once the pride of the Spanish quarters, became the heaviest curse of the night. Bars and ornaments littered the causeway's surface, spilled from broken packs and overturned carts. In the darkness, men reached for them instinctively, only to be struck down before they could lift them. Later, survivors would say that the lake itself seemed to hold on to the gold, as if it were unwilling to let it leave Tenochtitlan. Hours passed in a blur of fighting and retreat. By the time the survivors reached the end of the causeway and staggered onto the mainland, the first pale light of dawn was touching the eastern horizon. The column was no longer an army, but a scattering of exhausted, wounded men, their ranks broken, their losses heavy. They left behind not just treasure, but comrades, some drowned, some taken alive, some lying silent in the dark water. Mexica, still in control of the city, had turned the night into a clear message. Tenochtitlan could be entered, but it would not be left without a price. Cortés is said to have stood apart for a moment on that morning, looking back toward the lake. Whether he wept, as later stories claim, is uncertain, but the name given to that night, La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows, would carry its weight across centuries. The survivors did not have the luxury of mourning. The Mexica pursuit would not end at the edge of the lake. The road ahead was long, and the city they had fled would one day have to be faced again. But for now, the drums had stopped. Only the sound of the water remained, lapping quietly against the causeway where so much had been lost. Asterisk,